figured it out by now, I do have you read a lot of things, right? So the writers of the 1920s were equally important, and so I'm going to talk about the African American writers of the Harlem Renaissance first, and then I'll come back to the generation as a whole. Now, the first man I want to talk about is Langston Hughes, and what I tried to do here is get you some quotes for these men to see what they're going about. Langston Hughes said, "Hold fast to your dreams, for without them life is a broken winged bird that cannot fly." Langston Hughes is going to be considered what is called the poet laureate of the Harlem Renaissance. Basically, he's the most important poet. A big poem or a big story, if you want to go read it, is called Dreams Deferred. And that's a really, really good one. So he's a poet laureate of the Harlem Renaissance, most important writer of the Harlem Renaissance. Definitely go read some of his stuff. The next man we have is Claude McKay. Now, Claude McKay, again, is an important, he's a very important piece of the Harlem Renaissance. He says, "Oh, I must keep my heart inviolate against the potent poison of your hate." So he was not really worried about that. Now, his big thing that he wrote that a lot of people attribute to him was "If I Must Die." And there's a lot of civil rights tone in there. And he's kind of maybe a little more political than Langston Hughes. Although Langston Hughes did delve into the political a little bit, but Claude McKay definitely took it up. Now, the next person actually had to fight not only being African American but also being female, and she did it very, very well. Her name is Zora Neale Hurston, and she said, "Sometimes I feel discriminated against, but it does not make me angry. It merely astonishes me. How can any deny themselves the pleasure of my company? It's beyond me." Now, I just find that funny because she refused to let people get her down. Now, Zora Neale Hurston, her famous story was called "Their Eyes Are Watching God," and you can do that. And she actually had a publication for African American stories that was called Fire. And so she's very important. However, people tend to forget about her, and she kind of fell off the map for many, many years until a granddaughter or somebody related fell down the line, started putting these things out there, and it went from there. So those are the Harlem Renaissance writers. Now, there existed another group of writers, not in the Harlem Renaissance, but in the 1920s and 30s, and they were called the Lost Generation. These are writers after World War I who tend to be dissatisfied and very critical of the 1920s and the exuberance of wealth. And we have the meaning of Lost Generation, which can go back into the 1920s as well. Some people said Ernest Hemingway came up with it. Ernest Hemingway says, however, Gertrude Stein, who is the female back here, helped him come up with it. And so we're going to look at a couple of these writers and what they wrote. And so they're a generation of writers who are going to criticize society and how bad the 1920s are. Now, the first one I'm going to go is Sinclair Lewis. Sinclair Lewis, kind of funny in his writing. He says, "Winter is not a season, it's an occupation." So you might have to think on that one for a minute. Now, for Sinclair Lewis, what I need you to get, he is the first American writer to get the Nobel Peace Prize for his literature in the 1930s. He wrote many books like Babbitt and Main Street, and again, he's criticizing society. So he wins a Nobel Peace Prize for literature. That's pretty important stuff, right? The next man, something you've read before, right? F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote many books, right? But the biggest one people want to tend to remember is The Great Gatsby, because he is basically poking fun of the 1920s. And in class, I'll maybe give it a little bit more, but I don't want to ruin it in case you have the book. So I'm always probing there, what is the true story behind Great Gatsby. But just understand he's highly critical of this glitz and glamorous outside persona. And he brings to pass, he brings us to understand flappers and new morality with Tom and Daisy. And there's so much stuff about the 1920s here. I could go on about this probably for an hour, but I'm not. Now, one of the most important, and there's something really interesting with Cuba along this man too, and we'll talk about him here in a second. Ernest Hemingway was a ambulance driver in World War I, and we'll talk about one of his stories here in a second. But a lot of people said he was the key figure of the Lost Generation, wrote Old Man and the Sea, many, many things. He said, "Live the full life of the mind, exhilarated by new ideas, intoxicated by the romance of the unusual." He didn't want to do things as they were. He wanted to kind of step outside the lines. Now, one of his most famous books is called For Whom the Bell Tolls. If you're a fan of rock and roll music, you know that Metallica may have read this or maybe liked it, because they also have a song, For Whom the Bell Tolls. This is actually drawing on his experience as a World War I ambulance driver. They didn't have a siren, but rather a bell. And if you were ringing the bell, that meant you had somebody wounded. And if you're far away and didn't actually see it, the question is for whom it tolls. We don't know if it's friend or foe that got hurt, but somebody got hurt, and we need to concern ourselves about that. Now, Ernest Hemingway tragically committed suicide in Cuba. Since we have opened the consulate with Cuba in recent months and things like that, one of the big things that the American Writers Society wants to do is actually get to Ernest Hemingway's home in Cuba and kind of piece through the madness that's there. And so that should be really interesting. So pay attention to the news when they do that. All right, we have one more little section here, and they're going to kind of maybe be the heroes and artists and baseball players and things of that nature. All right,